Mr. Whitmore, step away from the terminal.
What is this about?
We trace the transfers directly to your login credentials.
For nearly 9 years, Malcolm Whitmore worked as a trusted cruise ship purser handling sensitive passenger financial accounts aboard one of the Caribbean's largest luxury, cruise lines. Co-workers described him as polished, reliable, and detail-oriented. But behind the scenes, investigators say Whitmore had been quietly exploiting weaknesses in the ship's financial systems for years.
I didn't steal anything.
Then why did 6 passenger accounts route money to your private banking app?
I want to call my attorney.
Copy.
Passengers aboard the Ocean Majesty. The ship represented exactly what the cruise line advertised in glossy television commercials and airport billboards across the country. Floating luxury, white linen dining rooms, multi-level casinos glowing deep into the night, endless Caribbean sunsets stretching beyond the upper decks. The vessel itself operated like a moving city, carrying more than 4,200 passengers and nearly 1,600 crew members between Miami, Nassau, San Juan, and Cozumel on 7-day itineraries nearly year-round. But behind the polished marble atriums and champagne lounges, the ship depended on a financial system built almost entirely on trust. At the center of that system was Malcolm Whitmore. At 38 years old, Black senior purser Malcolm Whitmore had spent nearly 9 years working aboard cruise ships operated by Atlantic Horizon Cruises, a Miami-based corporation generating billions annually through Caribbean tourism. Employees described him as composed, organized, and unusually calm under pressure. He wore pressed white uniforms even during overnight shifts. His shoes were polished. His workstation remained spotless. Supervisors trusted him with responsibilities most employees aboard never touched. As senior purser aboard the Ocean Majesty, Malcolm handled sensitive passenger financial operations that affected thousands of people every week. His office sat on Deck 3 near guest services, behind a secured frosted glass hallway accessible only through employee keycard entry. Inside, fluorescent ceiling lights hummed over aging Dell accounting terminals, receipt printers, cash drawers, and transaction monitors connected directly to Atlantic Horizon's onboard banking network. Most passengers never saw that side of the ship. They only saw the smiling employees behind the counters upstairs. What they did not realize was that every drink purchase, casino charge, excursion refund, medical payment, emergency wire request, and room balance flowed throughout. Systems employees like Malcolm controlled manually every single day. The workload was relentless. During active sailing periods, the financial office processed thousands of transactions every 24 hours. Guests lost cards. Families disputed charges. Elderly passengers requested emergency cash advances. Casino players demanded credit adjustments at 2 in the morning after drunken disputes over chips and account balances. Every issue eventually landed on someone's desk downstairs, usually Malcolm's. Co-workers later told investigators he rarely raised his voice. Even during high-pressure situations, he spoke softly and moved carefully, almost methodically. Younger crew members often went to him for help navigating passenger disputes because supervisors trusted his judgment. One employee later described him in an internal interview as the kind of guy nobody worried about. That perception mattered. Cruise ships operate under strange conditions compared to normal businesses. On land, employees live where they work. Contracts last months. Privacy barely exists. Crew members sleep in cramped cabins below passenger decks while working 12-hour shifts for weeks without a full day off. Financial departments faced especially intense pressure because accounting mistakes at sea could create international legal problems once ships reached foreign ports. And despite the luxury image sold to passengers, many employees aboard the Ocean Majesty were financially exhausted themselves. Some crew members sent most of their paychecks home to family overseas. Others worked consecutive contracts trying to pay off debt accumulated between sailings. Staffing shortages after the pandemic had increased workloads across nearly every department. Employees quietly complained about burnout in crew dining areas below Deck 1, where the fluorescent lights flickered and industrial ventilation fans rattled constantly overhead. Malcolm understood all of it. He had built a reputation as someone who could survive cruise life without emotionally falling apart, at least publicly. In early March of 2025, the Ocean Majesty departed PortMiami for another 7-day Caribbean loop carrying nearly full capacity. The itinerary itself was routine. Nassau first, then San Juan, then Cozumel before returning to Florida. But during that voyage, small financial discrepancies began appearing inside the onboard accounting system. At first, nobody treated them seriously. A retired passenger from Tampa reported missing onboard credit after canceling a snorkeling excursion in Nassau. 2 days later, another guest complained about duplicate beverage charges tied to a casino suite account. Then a family from Illinois disputed a delayed refund involving emergency medical services after their child became sick near Puerto Rico. Individually, the incident sounded ordinary. Cruise employees dealt with complaints constantly. But accounting staff downstairs slowly noticed something Usual, several disputed transactions appeared connected through the same authorization pathways inside the financial system. Temporary reversals processed correctly at first, then disappeared hours later after nightly reconciliations. The explanation internally was simple. Software problems. Atlantic Horizon Cruises had recently updated portions of its onboard payment software fleet-wide, and supervisors repeatedly blamed synchronization errors between shipboard systems and Miami-based accounting servers. Employees were instructed not to escalate concerns unless passengers demanded formal investigations. Most did not. Passengers typically accepted small onboard credits or complimentary dining vouchers rather than spending vacation time arguing over billing. Discrepancies. And that allowed the pattern to continue quietly. By late April, accounting clerks aboard the Ocean Majesty had begun privately documenting irregular refund adjustments connected to accounts Malcolm Whitmore purse. Only reviewed. Nothing directly suggested theft yet. But several employees noticed he frequently volunteered to stay late during overnight reconciliation periods when transaction logs were cleaned. Manually before syncing with company headquarters in Miami. One junior accounting employee later told investigators she remembered Malcolm becoming strangely protective of specific financial disputes. He'd say he already handled it, she explained during an interview months later. Like, almost too quickly. Still, supervisors avoided escalating concerns. Cruise companies survive on reputation. Public financial problems aboard a luxury ship could trigger lawsuits, cancellations, and federal scrutiny. Managers prioritized smooth operations above everything else. Internal emails later reviewed by investigators showed executives repeatedly encouraging shipboard staff to resolve guest concerns discreetly, without creating formal incident reports. Then came the complaint that changed everything. On May 14th, while the Ocean Majesty sailed back toward Miami from Cozumel, a passenger named Richard Ellsworth discovered nearly $18,000 missing from linked family travel accounts tied to onboard casino. Transfers and excursion reimbursements. Unlike previous guests, Ellsworth refused compensation vouchers and demanded printed transaction records immediately. According to internal logs, Malcolm Whitmore personally handled the complaint inside the Deck 3 financial office for nearly 90 minutes behind closed doors. The following morning, Ellsworth informed ship management he intended to contact attorneys once the vessel docked in Florida. And for the first time, Atlantic Horizon executives quietly authorized an internal audit of the Ocean Majesty's financial systems. But the audit would uncover discrepancies far larger than anyone on board expected. The internal audit began quietly 3 days after the Ocean Majesty returned to PortMiami. No public announcement was made. No employees aboard the ship were formally notified. Atlantic Horizon Cruises treated the situation like a containment issue, not a criminal investigation. Inside the company's Miami headquarters on Biscayne Boulevard, compliance analysts from the Financial Integrity Division were instructed to review transaction discrepancies connected to the Ocean Majesty's onboard accounting systems without disrupting normal operations. At first, investigators expected to find software failures. That explanation still seemed plausible. The company had recently migrated portions of its onboard payment infrastructure to a newer cloud-based reconciliation platform designed to asynchronize ship transactions with mainland banking servers in real time. Internal IT reports already documented occasional delays, duplicate authorizations, and synchronization conflicts involving onboard casino credits and excursion refunds. But within 48 hours, the audit team realized something else was happening. The discrepancies followed patterns. Inside a secured compliance office on the 17th floor, analysts spent hours reviewing spreadsheets under cold fluorescent lighting while copier machines echoed from nearby departments. Surveillance monitors displayed transaction logs from multiple ships simultaneously. Most employees worked quietly with headphones on while scrolling through endless rows of timestamps, passenger IDs, and adjustment codes. One analyst noticed that several disputed transactions aboard the Ocean Majesty involved dormant passenger accounts. That detail immediately stood out. Dormant accounts usually belonged to guests who had already completed their cruises, canceled excursions, or failed to use onboard promotional credits before disembarking. Normally those balances expired automatically or were refunded electronically through standardized processes. But in dozens of cases, small portions of those balances had been rerouted manually before final reconciliation. Not large amounts. That was the disturbing part. Most transactions ranged between $800 and $7,500. Small enough to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts inside Atlantic Horizon's monitoring system. Investigators later described the transfers as financial camouflage. The amounts blended naturally into the massive volume of legitimate daily activity processed aboard international cruise vessels. And the methods appeared deliberate. According to internal audit findings later referenced in federal court filings, the transfers were disguised through layered accounting reversals that made stolen funds appear like corrected adjustments or reimbursement. Reallocations. A canceled excursion refund might briefly move into a temporary holding category before portions were redirected through secondary balancing codes. Tied to onboard service credits. To anyone casually reviewing the system, the movements looked administrative. Routine. Boring even. But when investigators slowed records down chronologically, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Again and again, the same employee credentials appeared near the altered transactions, Malcolm Whitmore. At first, compliance officers hesitated to draw conclusions. Senior pursuers regularly accessed sensitive financial systems as part of their job responsibilities. Thousands of legitimate transactions carried Malcolm's authorization credentials every week, but timing became increasingly difficult to explain. A security badge records showed Black senior purser Malcolm Whitmore repeatedly entering the Deck 3 financial office between 1 and 4:30 in the morning during overnight reconciliation periods when passenger activity was lowest and supervisory oversight was limited. Then investigators reviewed workstation login histories. The records showed Malcolm accessing dormant passenger accounts outside his assigned queue responsibilities on at least 23 separate occasions over a 4-month period. Some sessions lasted only minutes, others stretched beyond an hour. Several occurred while the ship sailed between international jurisdictions where banking oversight became more complicated procedurally. That mattered enormously. Cruise ships operate through overlapping legal systems involving maritime law, foreign ports, international banking regulations, and corporate headquarters based in entirely different countries. Financial crimes committed at sea often move slowly through enforcement channels because jurisdiction itself becomes complicated, and Atlantic Horizon executives understood that immediately. Internal emails later obtained through court discovery showed senior leadership becoming visibly alarmed as preliminary loss estimates climbed beyond $2 lakh. One executive warned colleagues against creating unnecessary written exposure until outside counsel reviewed the findings. Another instructed department heads to avoid discussing the audit over unsecured ship communications. The company's priority was clear: contain the situation before passengers found out. Meanwhile, the evidence continued building. Investigators interviewed accounting clerks who worked alongside Malcolm aboard the Ocean Majesty. Several described subtle behaviors that seemed insignificant at the time but later appeared suspicious in hindsight. One employee recalled Malcolm insisting on personally resolving disputes involving high-value casino patrons. Another remembered him volunteering for overnight balancing shifts that most employees avoided because of exhaustion. He always had a reason. One clerk explained during a recorded interview, like he already knew which accounts needed fixing before we even reviewed them. Others described moments that felt strange only after the audit began. Malcolm closing office doors during routine account adjustments. Printing duplicate transaction summaries unnecessarily. Returning to terminals after coworkers left for meal breaks. None of it proved theft, but together the details created a pattern investigators could no longer dismiss. Then surveillance footage complicated things further. Security cameras positioned outside the financial office captured Malcolm entering restricted accounting areas during periods when no scheduled reconciliation work existed. In one timestamp from April 22nd, recorded at approximately 2:17 a.m. while the ship sailed north of San Juan, Malcolm remained inside the office alone for nearly 90 minutes after all other accounting staff had left. The footage itself showed nothing overtly criminal. No cash exchanges, no hidden meetings, just quiet isolation. But investigators noticed something else. During those same windows, dormant passenger accounts experienced manual adjustment activity from Malcolm's workstation credentials. By mid-June, Atlantic Horizon's internal estimates suggested potential losses exceeding $540,000 spread across multiple voyages and, hundreds of transactions. The realization triggered panic inside company leadership. Executives feared lawsuits, regulatory scrutiny, media exposure. Most of all, they feared public perception. Luxury cruise companies depend heavily on customer trust. Passengers routinely link debit cards, passports, medical information, and emergency funds to onboard systems while sailing far from land. A public financial scandal involving internal employee theft could devastate bookings across the entire industry. So the company escalated the matter quietly. Federal maritime authorities were contacted through the Department of Homeland Security's Port Security Division in Miami. Because the transactions crossed international waters and involved banking systems tied to foreign ports, the investigation immediately expanded beyond corporate compliance. Now federal investigators were reviewing the evidence too, and that changed the tone entirely. What began as a quiet internal audit was slowly becoming a criminal financial investigation involving interstate banking records, maritime jurisdiction, and potential wire fraud charges. But investigators still believed the missing money was likely moving through offshore laundering channels connected to international ports. Then, investigators discovered the transfers weren't ending inside offshore accounts. They were leading somewhere much closer to home. By the time federal maritime investigators formally joined the case in June of 2025, attention had already started shifting away from the Ocean Majesty itself and toward Malcolm Whitmore's life off the ship. That was where the numbers stopped making sense. According to employment records later introduced during court proceedings, a black senior purser Malcolm Whitmore earned approximately $96,000 annually before bonuses and contract incentives. It was a respectable salary within the cruise industry, especially for an employee without executive status. But investigators reviewing his recent spending patterns quickly realized his lifestyle appeared significantly more expensive than his reported income should have allowed. The first red flag came from a leased BMW X7 registered through a luxury dealership outside Fort Lauderdale. Then came the purchases. E-banking subpoenas later revealed thousands spent at designer retailers inside Miami's Brickell City Center. Louis Vuitton, Burberry, Gucci. Nearly $11,000 worth of electronics purchased over 6 months, including multiple MacBooks, premium watches, tablets, and high-end gaming equipment shipped to a condominium Malcolm rented near North Miami Beach. Individually, none of it looked criminal, but collectively, it painted a different picture, especially because friends and former co-workers described Malcolm very differently behind closed doors. Several people interviewed during the investigation said Malcolm spent years complaining about financial stress. One former crew member remembered him regularly borrowing small amounts of money between contracts while discussing overdue credit card debt and family obligations back home in Georgia. He always said he was broke, a coworker explained during a recorded interview. That's why people got confused later. Suddenly he's wearing designer stuff all the time. Another former employee described Malcolm returning from shore leave carrying expensive shopping bags while still talking openly about struggling. At first, coworkers assumed he had inherited money or started investing successfully. But the timing matched the suspected theft window almost exactly. Investigators also uncovered signs of escalating personal pressure in Malcolm's private life. Court records showed he had recently co-signed a vehicle loan for a relative, accumulated significant revolving debt, and faced mounting financial obligations connected to extended family support. Friends described him as intensely image-conscious, particularly around status and appearance. One former a keynote host aboard the Ocean Majesty later told investigators Malcolm seemed obsessed with looking successful. He wanted people to think he was doing better than everybody else, the employee said. Like cruise life wasn't getting to him. That detail became increasingly important once investigators examined Malcolm's connection to onboard gambling operations. Casino surveillance logs revealed Malcolm frequently remained inside restricted gaming areas long after his shifts ended. While employees were allowed to gamble during off-duty hours, records showed unusual transaction activity tied to Malcolm's player account, including rapid cash withdrawals and repeated high-limit table buy-ins during overnight hours. Federal investigators never publicly accused Malcolm of being addicted to gambling, but internally, analysts believed casino losses may have contributed to the financial pressure driving the scheme. The deeper investigators looked, the more complicated the money trail became. Forensic accountants assigned through Homeland Security's Financial Crimes Division began tracing the missing passenger funds through layered digital payment systems designed specifically to avoid automatic detection thresholds. Instead of moving large amounts directly into personal bank accounts, the transfers had allegedly been broken apart into dozens of smaller transactions routed through peer-to-peer payment apps, temporary digital wallets, and prepaid debit platforms. The structure appeared intentional. Investigators later described the activity as smurfing behavior, a method commonly used to prevent financial institutions from flagging suspicious transfers automatically. Amounts remained small enough individually to appear ordinary. $800 here, $1,500 there. Occasionally 4,000 or 5,000 routed through intermediary platforms before disappearing again within hours. One forensic analyst later testified that the movement patterns resembled Ione, testing the edges of the system repeatedly without triggering alarms. And the systems themselves made tracking extremely difficult. Because the transactions originated aboard international cruise vessels, portions of the financial trail passed temporarily through foreign banking networks connected to Caribbean ports before returning to domestic accounts. Every additional layer slowed investigators down. Still, patterns continued emerging. Surveillance footage obtained from PortMiami security cameras showed Malcolm visiting ATMs and banking kiosks shortly after the Ocean Majesty docked, following several Caribbean sailings. In one recording captured on May 28, Malcolm exited a crew transportation shuttle carrying a black backpack before entering a Wells Fargo branch less than 20 minutes later. The footage itself revealed nothing illegal, but investigators later matched the timestamp to multiple structured digital transfers processed aboard the ship less than 12 hours earlier. Additional surveillance records from San Juan and Nassau showed similar behavior. Malcolm separating briefly from crew groups after disembarkation periods, entering currency exchange locations, visiting banking terminals, remaining inside financial service centers for unusually short but repetitive periods. Server executives monitoring the investigation became increasingly nervous. Internal communications showed Atlantic Horizon leadership quietly coordinating with outside legal counsel while attempting to avoid alerting Malcolm. Prematurely. Executives feared that confronting him too early could compromise evidence collection or trigger the destruction of digital records needed for a federal prosecution. So they watched. Access logs were preserved silently. Security footage archived. Email backups copied from shipboard servers overnight while the Ocean Majesty continued operating regular passenger itineraries. Meanwhile, Oak workers aboard the ship began noticing changes in Malcolm's behavior. The calm professionalism people once trusted started slipping. Employees later described Malcolm becoming unusually defensive during routine accounting reviews. He questioned why supervisors suddenly requested printed reconciliation reports. He hovered near shared office printers while documents processed. One accounting clerk recalled seeing Malcolm feeding papers through a shredder late at night after other employees had already left the financial. Another coworker remembered Malcolm abruptly minimizing computer screens whenever people approached his workstation. He just seemed nervous all the time, the employee later told investigators, like he thought somebody was watching him. And in many ways, somebody was. Internal server records showed Malcolm deleting batches of archive emails connected to passenger account adjustments during periods when the audit intensified. Several deletion attempts failed because Atlantic Horizon's backup systems, automatically preserved copies remotely through mainland servers in Miami. That detail would later become critically important. But despite months of surveillance, transaction tracing, interviews, and forensic accounting reviews, investigators still faced a major problem. They could demonstrate suspicious patterns. They could identify manipulated accounts. They could trace financial movements linked indirectly to Malcolm Whitmore's credentials. But investigators still lacked the one piece of evidence needed to prove Malcolm Whitmore personally controlled the missing money. By July of 2025, the investigation surrounding Malcolm Whitmore had expanded far beyond Atlantic Horizon Cruises' internal compliance department. What started as a quiet accounting review was now being coordinated through a multi-agency investigative task group involving cruise security, personnel, Homeland Security financial crimes analysts, federal maritime investigators, and PortMiami law enforcement liaisons. Meetings were conducted behind closed doors inside a secured conference room on the 14th floor of Atlantic Horizon's headquarters while the Ocean Majesty continued operating scheduled Caribbean sailings with thousands of passengers still on board. And Malcolm had no idea how closely he was being watched. Federal investigators believed they were approaching the final stage of the case. But prosecutors still needed direct evidence proving Black senior purser Malcolm Whitmore personally initiated the fraudulent transfers. Suspicion alone would not survive federal court scrutiny. They needed live activity, time-stamped evidence, clear digital attribution. So investigators made a decision. Instead of confronting Malcolm immediately, they would monitor him during one final active voyage aboard the Ocean Majesty. The operation began quietly before the ship departed Miami on July 18th for another 7-day Caribbean itinerary through Nassau, San Juan, and Cozumel. Cruise executives coordinated discreetly with ship security supervisors while federal investigators installed additional monitoring tools directly into the vessels. Accounting infrastructure. Most employees aboard never noticed anything had changed, but inside the Deck 3 financial office, nearly every system Malcolm touched was now being tracked. Workstation monitoring software was deployed remotely through Atlantic Horizon's mainland servers, allowing investigators in Miami to observe screen activity in real time. Security badge logs were configured for enhanced timestamp reporting. Encrypted server access records captured keystroke-level authentication data whenever privileged financial accounts were accessed. Real-time transaction alerts were also activated silently in the background. Any unusual account movement involving dormant balances, reimbursement reversals, casino credits, or manual adjustment codes would immediately trigger notifications inside a secure monitoring room located at Atlantic Horizon's corporate offices in Miami. The atmosphere inside that room reportedly felt tense from the very beginning. According to later testimony, investigators worked in rotating overnight shifts while large surveillance monitors displayed live accounting activity flowing directly from the Ocean Majesty at sea. Empty coffee cups stacked beside keyboards. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead continuously. Analysts watched transaction queues refresh second by second, while maritime radio chatter crackled softly through communication consoles nearby. And slowly, the pressure aboard the ship itself started becoming noticeable. Rumors spread first among accounting employees. Workers began whispering about unusual server slowdowns and unexplained login verification requests appearing inside the financial system. Some suspected a cybersecurity upgrade. Others feared layoffs or internal disciplinary reviews tied to previous accounting discrepancies. Several crew members later admitted to privately suspected Malcolm, but most still struggled to believe the accusations could actually be true. One employee recalled seeing Malcolm sitting unusually still during a routine reconciliation meeting near the middle of the voyage. Normally calm and conversational, he reportedly avoided eye contact and responded to supervisors with short, clipped answers while absent-mindedly tapping a pen against the conference table. He looked exhausted, the employee later said, like he hadn't slept. The pressure intensified further as the ship approached San Juan. A security record showed Malcolm repeatedly entering restricted accounting areas during overnight hours, despite having no scheduled reconciliation assignments. Badge logs captured him accessing the financial office at 1:13 a.m., 2:42 a.m., and again shortly after 4 a.m. over consecutive nights. Each entry automatically triggered silent alerts back in Miami. Investigators watched everything live. Then came the night purr, a prosecutors would later describe as the turning point of the entire case. According to federal records, the critical activity occurred on July 23 while the Ocean Majesty sailed northbound between Puerto Rico and the Bahamas. At approximately 2:11 a.m. ship time, Malcolm logged into a secured reimbursement management terminal inside the Deck 3 accounting office using elevated authorization credentials, assigned specifically to senior pursers. The login itself was not unusual. What happened afterward was, screen recording software installed days earlier allegedly captured Malcolm accessing dormant passenger reimbursement files connected to canceled luxury excursion packages. Investigators watched remotely as several transaction windows opened simultaneously across the terminal screen. And then the funds started moving. According to forensic reports later referenced in court proceedings, Malcolm initiated multiple staged reversals involving passenger balances, ranging from approximately $1,200 to $6,800. The transactions were routed temporarily through intermediary adjustment categories designed to resemble routine reconciliation corrections. But investigators were now seeing the process unfold in real time. Digital monitoring systems captured associated IP routing information. Timestamp synchronization records. And linked external payment credentials connected to peer-to-peer transfer platforms already flagged during the earlier phases of the investigation. One federal analyst later testified that the room became completely silent once investigators realized they were watching the transfers happen live. No one spoke for several seconds, they simply watched the screens. Additional server logs allegedly showed intermediary transaction identifiers matching digital wallet accounts investigators had previously connected indirectly to Malcolm's financial activity off the ship. Simultaneously, system records captured failed deletion attempts involving temporary account histories shortly after the transfers processed. That detail became especially damaging. Prosecutors would later argue the deletion attempts demonstrated consciousness of guilt rather than routine administrative behavior. Still, investigators chose not to intervene immediately. That decision was strategic. Arresting Malcolm aboard the ship created serious legal complications involving passenger visibility, international waters, evidence preservation, and jurisdictional authority. Federal investigators wanted the arrest conducted publicly and cleanly once the vessel returned to United States territory. So they waited. Meanwhile, Malcolm's behavior reportedly deteriorated further during the final days of the voyage. Coworkers noticed him pacing outside the financial office during overnight hours. One employee later described seeing Malcolm abruptly close laptop screens whenever people entered shared workspaces. Another recalled him snapping defensively at a junior accounting clerk who questioned a delayed reimbursement adjustment. The tension aboard the Ocean Majesty became impossible to ignore. Some employees feared an active federal investigation was unfolding on board. Others worried the company intended to scapegoat lower-level staff to contain public fallout. Supervisors quietly instructed employees not to discuss accounting operations with passengers under any circumstances. But by then, investigators already believed they had enough evidence to move forward. Federal agents coordinated final arrest logistics with PortMiami authorities while the ship completed its final approach into Florida waters. Plainclothes officers prepared credential packets and arrest documentation inside a secured staging office near Terminal V. Cruise executives were notified only hours beforehand to minimize internal leaks. And throughout all of it, Malcolm Whitmore continued working his scheduled shifts aboard the Ocean Majesty. When the ship finally reached Port Malcolm Whitmore had no idea federal agents were already waiting at the gangway. Federal agents boarded the Ocean Majesty before sunrise on July 26, 2025. Most passengers were still asleep when the ship eased into PortMiami under gray early morning skies. Our crew members prepared for standard disembarkation procedures while loudspeaker announcements echoed softly through passenger corridors above deck. 5. Luggage carts rattled across metal flooring. Customs officers waited inside the terminal building. From the outside, the arrival looked completely routine. Inside the ship, it was anything but routine. According to later testimony and internal security reports, CIS federal agents accompanied by PortMiami law enforcement personnel boarded through a restricted service entrance shortly after 6:10 a.m. cruise. Security supervisors quietly escorted them through lower maintenance corridors normally inaccessible to passengers. The atmosphere reportedly felt tense immediately. Employees steppy. On the side and narrow hallways watched silently as investigators moved toward the Deck 3 financial offices, carrying sealed document folders and, federal credential cases. Radio traffic crackled softly through earpieces while ship security temporarily restricted employee movement around the accounting department. Malcolm Whitmore was already inside the office when agents arrived. Surveillance footage later reviewed during court proceedings showed Black senior purser Malcolm Whitmore seated at his workstation reviewing overnight reconciliation reports beneath fluorescent lighting while receipt printers hummed nearby. Investigators later noted that he appeared calm in the minutes before contact was made. Then the office door opened. One federal investigator identified himself and instructed Malcolm to step away from the terminal immediately. Coworkers later described the room falling completely silent. Several accounting employees stood frozen beside nearby workstations as agents owned themselves around Malcolm's desk. One crew member later testified that Malcolm initially looked confused rather than panicked. He reportedly glanced toward his monitor, then toward the hallway where additional officers blocked the office exit. "What's going on?" he asked quietly. The lead investigator responded carefully. "Mr. Whitmore, we need you to come with us regarding an ongoing federal financial investigation." According to witness statements, Malcolm hesitated for several seconds before standing slowly from his chair. He did not resist. He did not raise his voice. But employees later recalled noticing his hands trembling slightly as he removed his identification badge and placed it beside the keyboard. The escort through the ship became one of the most discussed moments in the entire case. Crew members lining nearby service corridors watched silently as Malcolm was escorted past guest service counters toward a restricted holding office, near the embarkation level. Employees reportedly looked shocked. Others avoided eye contact entirely. By the time passengers began exiting the vessel above them, rumors had already spread across multiple departments on board. Something serious had happened. Inside a secured interview room near the port terminal, federal investigators began the first formal interrogation only hours after the arrest. The setting itself was sterile and uncomfortable. Gray walls, folding tables, a constantly humming HVS event overhead. Bodycam equipment and document binders stacked neatly beside a digital recorder blinking red at the center of the table. At first, Malcolm denied everything. Investigators presented printed transaction logs showing hundreds of manipulated passenger reimbursement entries tied directly to his employee credentials. Malcolm responded by blaming software synchronization problems aboard the Ocean Majesty. The systems glitch constantly. He reportedly said during the interview. Everybody knows that. But investigators kept pushing. They presented workstation monitoring footage captured during the July 23 overnight surveillance operation. Screen recordings allegedly showed Malcolm accessing dormant passenger reimbursement accounts and rerouting funds through layered intermediary adjustment categories linked to external payment platforms already under federal review. Malcolm's demeanor reportedly shifted almost immediately after seeing the footage. According to interrogation notes later referenced during court proceedings, he stopped making eye contact for extended periods and began responding more slowly to questions. Several answers became vague or non-committal. Investigators then introduced banking records. Subpoenaed financial data allegedly linked structured digital deposits directly to accounts associated with Malcolm's personal devices and peer-to-peer payment applications. Additional records showed repeated transaction overlaps between manipulated passenger reimbursements and cash withdrawals conducted shortly after the Ocean Majesty docked in Miami, Nassau, and San Juan. Federal analysts estimated total losses at approximately $540,000. That number changed the tone of the room completely. At one point during the interrogation, an investigator reportedly slid printed screenshots of encrypted digital communications across the table. Prosecutors later claimed the messages showed Malcolm discussing financial transfers and account limitations connected to outside payment services. Malcolm reportedly stared at the documents silently for several moments before leaning backward in his chair and rubbing both hands across his face. Then came a long pause. Nearly 20 seconds passed without anyone speaking. Finally, Malcolm quietly said, "I think I need an attorney." The interview ended shortly afterward. Outside the terminal, news crews had already started gathering after law enforcement radio traffic alerted local media outlets to a federal assist involving a cruise ship employee. By midday, cell phone footage recorded by passengers began spreading online showing federal agents escorting Malcolm through restricted POT areas in handcuffs. The reaction was immediate. Passengers interviewed outside the terminal described feeling shocked that financial crimes of that scale could allegedly happen aboard a luxury cruise vessel trusted with sensitive banking information. You give them your cards, your passports, everything. One passenger told reporters near the terminal entrance. You never think somebody inside the ship could be stealing from people. Atlantic Horizon Cruises entered crisis management mode within hours. The company issued carefully worded public statements emphasizing cooperation with federal authorities while avoiding direct admissions regarding internal oversight failures. Emergency audits were immediately expanded across multiple ships in the fleet. Certain onboard reimbursement systems were temporarily suspended pending security reviews. Additional transaction verification requirements were implemented fleet-wide almost overnight. Behind the scenes, executives feared catastrophic reputational damage, and the media attention only made things worse. National news outlets seized on the unusual nature of the allegations almost immediately. Headlines describing a luxury cruise purser accused of stealing hundreds of thousands from passengers spread rapidly across television broadcasts, YouTube commentary channels, financial news sites, and social media platforms. The setting itself made the story irresistible. A trusted employee, a floating luxury resort, international waters, hidden financial manipulation happening beneath vacation entertainment, and Caribbean tourism. Within days, the case became one of the most widely discussed white-collar maritime crime stories in the country. But the courtroom proceedings would reveal even deeper failures inside the cruise line's financial oversight system. The federal trial of Malcolm Whitmore began in February of 2026 inside the United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida in downtown Miami. By then, the case had already become a national media story. Satellite trucks lined portions of Northwest 4th Street during the opening days of testimony, while reporters crowded the courthouse security, a checkpoint each morning waiting for updates. True crime channels dissected financial evidence online. Travel forums filled with passengers questioning whether cruise ship banking systems had ever truly been secure at all. Inside courtroom 11B, the atmosphere felt colder and quieter than the media frenzy outside. Federal prosecutors spent nearly 3 weeks constructing a detailed timeline of what they described as a long-running financial theft operation, hidden inside the Ocean Majesty's onboard accounting systems. Large digital monitors displayed transaction spreadsheets, workstation screen recordings, ice stamp logs, and surveillance footage collected during the investigation. The government's strategy was methodical. Instead of relying on emotional arguments, prosecutors focused almost entirely on records, thousands of them. Forensic accountants walked jurors through layered reimbursement transfers tied to dormant passenger accounts. Cybersecurity specialists explained how specific authorization credentials linked directly to Black senior purser Malcolm Whitmore's workstation. Ascensions during overnight reconciliation periods aboard the ship. One Homeland Security analyst testified for nearly 4 hours regarding encrypted payment routing systems and digital wallet tracing. The details became highly technical. Jurors listened as prosecutors explained how intermediary transfer structures allegedly disguised stolen passenger funds through temporary adjustment categories before routing smaller amounts into linked peer-to-peer payment platforms. Timestamp synchronization reports show suspicious transaction activity repeatedly overlapping with Malcolm's employee access records and personal financial deposits. Then prosecutors displayed the workstation footage. The courtroom reportedly became completely silent as jurors watched screen recordings captured during the July 23 surveillance operation. Aboard the Ocean Majesty. The footage allegedly showed Malcolm accessing reimbursement systems tied to canceled passenger excursions before routing portions of those balances. Through layered adjustment codes connected to external payment credentials already flagged during the investigation. For prosecutors, it was the centerpiece of the case. But Malcolm's defense team approached the trial very differently. Rather than denying accounting irregularities entirely. Defense attorneys argued the cruise company itself had created dangerously weak financial oversight systems vulnerable to manipulation by numerous employees across multiple departments. And in many ways, I had a point. Defense experts testified that Atlantic Horizon Cruises relied heavily on outdated reconciliation software, inconsistent employee verification procedures, and fragmented cybersecurity protections spread across international maritime systems. Some terminals aboard the Ocean Majesty reportedly lacked modern multi-factor authentication entirely during portions of the alleged theft period. One defense cybersecurity consultant described the company's internal controls as procedurally negligent. The defense also emphasized that dozens of employees possessed elevated system access aboard the vessel. Accounting clerks, supervisors, casino managers, and senior guest service personnel all interacted with portions of the same financial infrastructure. Access does not equal ownership. One attorney told jurors repeatedly throughout the trial. The implication was clear. Malcolm Whitmore may have been careless. He may have violated policy. But according to the defense, prosecutors could not conclusively prove he alone controlled every stage of the missing money trail. Federal prosecutors pushed back aggressively. Introduced login histories showing Malcolm repeatedly accessing dormant passenger accounts during unscheduled overnight hours. Banking analysts linked structured deposits to devices associated directly with Malcolm's personal accounts. A surveillance records placed him at financial institutions shortly after suspicious transfers processed aboard the ship. Then came the victim statements. Those moments shifted the emotional tone of the trial significantly. A retired couple from Arizona testified that missing reimbursement funds forced them to freeze personal accounts while stranded temporarily in Nassau. During the investigation period, another passenger described losing emergency travel funds connected to medical treatment for her son aboard the ship. One witness struggled visibly while explaining how long it took to recover disputed charge. ICE tied to family savings accounts. We trusted the cruise line completely, she told the court quietly. We thought our information was safe. The reputational damage surrounding Atlantic Horizon cruises only worsened as the trial continued. Federal maritime regulators launched broader reviews into onboard financial security practices across multiple cruise operators. Internal corporate emails revealed during testimony showed executives delaying certain system upgrades due to budget concerns despite repeated warnings from compliance staff years earlier. That revelation created serious backlash. By the final week of proceedings, media coverage had expanded beyond Malcolm Whitmore himself and toward the cruise industry's larger oversight failures. Financial commentators questioned why international passenger banking systems aboard luxury vessels operated with weaker controls than many small, island-based businesses. After nearly 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on multiple federal fraud and wire transfer charges. The sentencing hearing took place 3 months later. Malcolm appeared noticeably different by then. Courtroom observers described him as thinner, quieter, emotionally withdrawn. During portions of the hearing, he reportedly stared downward at the defense table without reacting while prosecutors reviewed financial losses tied to the case. When given an opportunity to speak before sentencing, Malcolm addressed the court briefly. According to courtroom transcripts, he apologized to affected passengers and acknowledged serious mistakes, though he stopped short of fully admitting intentional theft. At several points his voice reportedly became difficult to hear. The judge responded bluntly. In a lengthy statement criticizing both individual conduct and institutional negligence, the court described the case as a reflection of greed enabled by systemic corporate complacency. The judge specifically condemned Atlantic Horizon on cruises for allowing weak oversight systems to persist despite earlier warning signs. Malcolm Whitmore was ultimately sentenced to federal prison along with substantial restitution obligations tied to passenger losses. But even after sentencing, the fallout continued spreading through the cruise industry. Major operators implemented new transaction monitoring software, mandatory multi-factor authentication systems, expanded employee auditing protocols, and tighter overnight reconciliation controls. Several cruise lines reduced manual reimbursement authority entirely, shifting portions of financial processing back to mainland compliance centers. Passengers noticed the changes immediately. Additional ID verification, delayed account adjustments, stricter reimbursement procedures, more visible fraud warnings inside cruise mobile apps. Trust had been damaged. And for many travelers, the image of luxury cruise ships as isolated floating resorts suddenly felt far less comforting than before, because underneath the casinos, restaurants, ocean views, and entertainment theaters, passengers now understood something they rarely considered previously. Massive financial systems were operating quietly behind closed doors, often with very little oversight at all. And for thousands of passengers who once believed their money was secure at sea, the scandal changed the way they looked at cruise travel forever.